The following panel discussion took place on May 17th and discusses the sexual health education event Consent Cafe. It's important to note that when we talk about consent, it's also necessary to recognize Canada's occupation of Indigenous lands without consent and the ways in which coercion and violence have been inflicted on Indigenous peoples' bodies and lands through colonialism. Alongside every act of violence exists a parallel story of resistance to that violence. And so, Indigenous peoples' historical and ongoing resistance to colonial violence must also be recognized. The TRU campus in Kamloops is situated on the lands of the Kamloops to Secwepemc within the Secwepemc Ulu, the traditional and unceded territory of the Secwepemc people.
Hello, everyone. I'm really excited that everyone can make it today. I'm a psychology student at TRU, and this summer I'm working with the TRU Wellness Centre with Chelsea, doing kind of social media, the live chat, and then I'm helping to kind of create some resources and organize events. And then I'm also working with FSD, with Alicia, doing kind of helping with the annual report and doing little projects here and there, like this interview today and this newsroom story. So I'm really excited about all this work that I'm doing, and I'm really excited to speak with you all today. I want to start with a little definition of consent. I know everyone here knows what consent means, but because we're recording it and later people might watch it and want to have that kind of definition right off the bat to get us started, I will provide one. Consent is the mutual agreement to participate in an activity. It is continuous and ongoing and can be given or taken away at any time. It must be communicated clearly, and there are certain situations in which consent cannot be given in the eyes of the law. Okay, so I think we can start some introductions. Just kind of say who you are, what organization you're representing, and also what kind of work you do for them. So maybe we'll start with Alicia, and then we can kind of go from there.
Yeah, I'm so happy to be here. My name is Alicia Ashcroft. My pronouns are she, her, and I'm the writer and storyteller for the Faculty of Student Development. And part of my work is supporting the Wellness Centre and Sexualized Violence Prevention and Response and supporting community connections. And I'm a longtime survivor, and so this work is extremely meaningful to me. So I'm happy to be here.
Awesome. Maybe Chelsea can go next.
Thank you, Hannah. My name is Chelsea Corsi. My pronouns are also she and her. And I also just want to acknowledge that I'm calling in today from the traditional unceded territory of Kamloops Secwepemc within Secwepemc Ulu, the traditional unceded lands of the Secwepemc people. And just I think this is part of decolonizing consent is to acknowledge a historical context where lands were taken without consent. And so I think that's really important part of our discussion around consent. And just, yeah, so I coordinate the Wellness Center at TRU. I've been there for going on 17 years. I see all your beautiful faces and I'm so excited that you all are allies in this work and all collaborators, and we have all worked together in some shape or form around this topic for the past many years. And so I also, though a second hat I wear is I'm currently on the Kamloops Sexual Assault Counseling Center Board of Directors, which I've been on for 6 years. And so the work around sexualized violence prevention and response is super close and near and dear to my heart. So it's just, thank you for the opportunity to talk about it today.
Thank you, Chelsea. Megan, how about you go next? You're comfortable?
Yeah, absolutely. So my name is Megan Haggerty. I also coming to you from the traditional unceded territories of the Secwepemc people, and I do use she, her pronouns. I don't know if that caught in there before. I'm a sexualized violence prevention and response manager at TRU, so basically providing different services and supports for survivors as well as for the wider campus. So that can be direct survivor support, it can be supporting support people, providing education opportunities for the campus community and helping people understand the policy and the avenues through that. So a couple different, quite a few pieces to that role. I think that's all. I'm also super excited to be here and be part of this event. Thanks.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Tanya, you're next on my screen, so if you're ready to go.
Thank you. So yes, I'm Tanya Pollock, and I'm also calling from the Kamloops Secwepemc territory, where I'm a settler, uninvited, but appreciate the opportunity to live, play, work, and grow on this land. I am a faculty member at the School of Social Work and Human Services, and I particularly teach in the School of Human, or in the program of Human Services. I'm also the president of the board of directors of the Kamloops Sexual Assault Counseling Centre. One of the things that outside of these two roles that draws me to this work that we're doing is in my previous work experience before teaching, I spent more than 10 years supporting children and youth who experienced sexualized violence. So this is a focus that's dear to my heart. I also am the mother of a 15-year-old who is in a very delicate and tremendously honestly dangerous time in her life as far as sexualized violence goes. And so anything I can do to increase her sense of safety and the sense of safety of others in their lived experience, in their community, in their SD 73 district, and potentially TRU or other university campuses, I'm pleased to participate in. And I didn't mention, but always should, that my pronouns are she and her.
Awesome. Thank you so much. And Alex, last but not least.
Hello, everyone. My name is Alex Dolson. My pronouns are she, her. I am an uninvited guest in Secwepemcúlecw. And I'm the agency coordinator at the Kamloops Sexual Assault Counseling Centre. And so KSAC is a nonprofit organization that offers support services to survivors of sexualized violence. So whether that's sexual assault, childhood sexual abuse, or domestic violence. And in this role, most of our work is reactive support work. And so I have a front row view to the trauma that comes from sexualized violence. So it's important, I think, for us to take a moment to acknowledge how important prevention work is. And it doesn't get enough attention and it doesn't get enough funding, but that is how we make change. So I'm excited to be a part of a project that's actually doing some of that change work in our community. Yeah, thank you for having me.
Thank you for coming. And yes, I hope that we kind of get into all the nitty-gritties of how it's so important to be doing this work and how all of the work that everyone here is doing is just so incredibly valuable. So I'm sure we will get to that at some point today in this discussion. Okay, so the first item on our list is what is the history of the consent tea?
I can go because it came to me one day in my office, in my windowless office on the TRU campus. So prior to, as Megan mentioned in her role, having a position around sexualized violence prevention and response is relatively, I mean, we're 5 years, I guess, actually anniversary, which is awesome. But prior to that, as I mentioned, I've been on campus for 17 years. So my work around sexual health education did involve some work around sexual assault at the time. That was kind of the language that was used a long time ago. And actually, one of my first encounters with Tanya was when she was working at KSAC as a counselor. And her and I connected back in 2004, probably 5, where I brought her actually to campus and she facilitated a workshop about sexual assault and sexualized violence prevention. And so in fall 2015, we often in the fall in November did a sexual health week. And so I was really like, I've seen this viral video. Everyone probably knows it now. Consent is as simple as tea. And I thought, wow, this is like very accessible in terms of speaking about consent. Now, I know since that's a long time ago now, there's been a lot of critiques, and Megan and I have talked about this a lot around it's not complex enough. Sexualized violence is a systemic issue, and talking rape culture, and it's a big concern. However, sometimes when you're starting to have conversations and wanting people to feel safe talking about a topic that is stigmatized, you need to start simple. You need to bring it down so that there's an accessibility point to help increase people's literacy. And it's kind of a stepping stone approach. And so for me, it was intriguing. And so also Downton Abbey was like super popular on Netflix at the time. It had come over from, Britain, and people were loving it. And so I just kind of literally one day I was like, why don't we actually host a consent tea? And being in nursing and social work and other kind of like sort of helping health professions, it is what we call praxis. So it's like bringing the theoretical knowledge you're learning about something and like actually doing it, like practicing that knowledge, which kind of helps you align the concepts. And so for me, it was really that exercise and praxis. So bringing, like, if we're sitting together, drinking tea, thinking about the messages around consent and its relationship to, like, you wouldn't force someone to drink tea if they said no, or if someone's passed out, you wouldn't force them to drink tea. Why, like, how is sex any different, right? So it is a lot different, but it's just that action. And so we hosted our first consent tea in a very quick turnaround time, to be honest, in 2015. And what, to me, like, I get emotional thinking about it, was we had tables set up in Student Street, we had beautiful linens, we had flowers on the tables, we all dressed up, we had real china, we had tea, we had cookies. We acknowledged, we couldn't, it was kind of like a come and go. It wasn't like we didn't do a big announcement. We had student leaders at every table helping to make people feel comfortable. But when I saw, like, a diverse group of students of various genders, various ethnic backgrounds, sitting together, drinking tea and talking about consent, like, that's for me, like, where, like, why I love my job. And so the feedback we got from that event was very positive. And so we've just continued on. And so, as Hannah, you will know, as being on the Student Wellness Ambassador team this year, we hosted our 6th annual consent tea in the fall. We did a virtual setting based on COVID, but still the richness of the dialogue continues. As well, what I found awesome is that we had actually TRU alumni who saw it and attended because they missed the consent tea and wanted to be a part of it. So that's sort of the history. Megan and I, when she came into her role, she actually did a leave for me, and so she hosted the consent tea in 2016 because I was on leave. And then in her role where she is now, we've collaborated over the number of years because now we had a person in a position. And so I'm very proud of our work as a team. Megan and I, we wrote a consent tea toolkit where we've shared this with other post-secondaries across Canada at a conference and through a published online toolkit we put together. We've also written an article for a US researcher who does a lot of work in student affairs. And so actually it's super cool because we've had that positive feedback, not just from our students, but from other people across in our colleagues across Canada. So that's my long Chelsea Coles Notes version, but I'm very proud of it because it has over the years grown and developed, and I like the fact that it's accessible for many people.
Wow, that was a really awesome answer and really cool to hear and see kind of how you feel about the whole thing and the role that you've played, the very important role that you've played in the consent tea at TRU. Does anybody else want to add anything just about the history of consent tea? Okay, because, go ahead.
I was just going to say, though, I appreciate how, Chelsea, when you were saying that, the message of the consent tea, like not the consent tea, the consent is as simple as tea. Like, you can see how that message has shifted, but really you created an access point. And actually, I just wrote down the word dignity and dignified because it is a very dignified way to have this conversation, and having like those little teacups and having like all of those pieces just really made it so easy to have those conversations, because I think so often these conversations are sort of like shrouded and we're whispering it. So to have this like proper cup of tea and a biscuit and discussing consent, I think that event really brings this dignified approach to that, and it's accessible and people were able to have those conversations. So I just wanted to give that a shout out.
That's such a great point, Alicia, and I think it just helps to kind of normalize the conversation, right? I think part of it, the whole issue with stigma and people feeling uncomfortable, is that we haven't created any space for people to feel comfortable talking about it. And
Megan, I would ask Megan if she wants to add, because I saw her unmute there for a second as a collaborator.
Yeah, I was just going to say it's also been really interesting to see how it's evolved and grown over the years too. So being able to incorporate different kinds of activities that might speak to people in different ways has been, I think, a really cool development from, I didn't see the first year, but I've seen so that's been cool.
Yeah, I hear you. And Tanya, I also saw that you unmuted if there's anything you'd like to add.
Well, I could speak to the more current iteration that we're looking at, but I just wanted to emphasize the work that Chelsea and Megan have done to create this this sensitive, responsive opportunity for people to talk about consent in a way we've never talked about consent on our campus before. And even while we had big conversations around sexualized violence on campus, the consent T continued to function alongside, but also despite. And we heard about it from students, and we heard about it from our colleagues, and of course from Chelsea and Megan themselves. And the response is, there's so much gratitude for starting the conversation and starting the work and being fearless in starting the work too.
Thank you so much for adding that. I think that piece around fearless in starting the work is so important. And thank you for adding that. Okay, so how has these kind of past events and this whole conversation around the consent tea and the importance of it kind of made way for this consent cafe that's happening at KSA?
I will just quickly say, and then maybe because Tanya and I have been talking about this for ages and a year, so she could give you the impetus. But for me, as I mentioned, before we had a position that focused on sexualized violence prevention and response, we had a task force on campus for a year. And we were actually, TRU was actually leading the way provincially in this. Our dean, now AVP of students, Chris Adam, led this work. And so it was quite an intentional process over the course of a year where we had different working groups, and I was leading the education prevention working group. And learned a lot, like you were saying before we started, Hannah, about this process. And my passion is prevention, like Alex mentioned, right? So Alex, definitely what I know also for sitting on the board is there lots of funding for that intervention, support, counseling piece. But for me, when I was thinking about recommendations putting forth to this task force around what would go forth to the president, because it was a president's task force, was around if we look at who comes to TRU, what students come here. Many of the people who graduate with an SD 73, so our local school district, come to TRU at least for the first couple years before they might transfer, but a lot do come here. And so for me, I was like, how do we have a common language around consent and sexualized violence that starts early on? So that as students who graduate and then decide to come to TRU for their post-secondary education, the conversation isn't a new one for them. It is a consistent conversation that starts early. I mean, I'm a parent of kids, and we talked about that. I started talking about this kind of stuff with my kids when they were very little. They are lucky to have a nurse as a mom who's very open about, this type of thing. But I was like, how can we as TRU help provide some of that context? So this is this is in my own head for like 7 years thinking about how this can actually happen. And so that was kind of for me part of that, like, consistent language, consistent literacy throughout and starting early. And so Tanya could probably speak a bit more specifically to this particular project about how we sort of started.
Sure, I'd be pleased to. So I had an experience with the TRU Mind the Gap program in 2019. So that experience was so amazing, and it was so amazing that I had to bring it to Chelsea and say, hey, have you ever considered this? Would you be willing to partner? So the TRU Mind the Gap project looks at the sustainable K-16 university community partnership, and it is a partnership through the Center of Excellence in Learning and Teaching at TRU and the Faculty of Education and Social Work at TRU, as well as the school district. And within this project, they support the development of collaborative projects between faculty, on-campus faculty, and community teachers. And for my particular project, we looked at the UN Convention of the Rights of the Child art project, which had learning outcomes that aligned with my child and youth care course, and my introduction to child and youth care course, where we learn about child rights, and the grade 2 curriculum where they learn about their rights as children. So we were able to align those outcomes and bring students onto campus, and for 2 visits have a particular focus on child rights and have an art project developed around that. And it was such an amazing experience for everyone. The feedback was so tremendous from TRU students, from SD 73 students, and notably, as the students were leaving, they were high-fiving us as they left the Irving Cape Arbor Center. Now, I'll remind you, it was 2019, pre-COVID, where you could still high-five people. The kiddos were saying, see you in 9 years, see you in 9 years, see you in 9 years, right? And so they just innately understood the nature of this K to 16 project. They innately understood that TRU campus is their campus, just like SD73 is their campus too, right? And so in sharing that experience with Chelsea, we started to think about how could we take what we know about consent and what we know is lapsed in understanding about consent on campus and bring it to students earlier when it's going to have meaningful growth opportunity rather than just us reacting, as Alex said earlier. How can we be responsive? Yeah. So I impose myself is basically what I'm saying.
But remember, the Mind the Gap, we weren't unable to get funding because of COVID.
That's right.
So for me, we were kind of like, what's a workaround here? And so knowing that it was TRU's 50th anniversary and there was funds available for anyone who wanted to do a community project. So it actually aligned that TRU had some money to engage with communities. And so we applied for, and from our Faculty of Student Development funds, got $1,000 to actually be able to buy gift bags, give honorariums. We're putting together some, as Hannah knows because she's helping do it, put together some cool Consent Cafe journals. So that was how we kind of got a little bit of money. It's not a ton of money, but a little bit of a start so that we could actually offer this to the community.
Yeah, it's a seed. And when we're talking about when we're talking about consent work, we really are talking about relational work and how we have to warm in to these relationships, right? So that little bit of seed money, this relationship with Philippa that we've developed at the Kamloops School of the Arts, this is our opportunity to be present and to prove ourselves worthy enough to engage in these consent conversations with their school community, hopefully.
Oh, definitely, I think. And those are great answers. Thank you so much for kind of clearing up that history of the relationship between kind of how this consent tea turned into consent cafe and this relationship between the university, sexualized violence prevention, and SD73. And Alex, I'm going to pick on you a little bit because you've been so quiet. So I'm going to ask you kind of from your perspective at KSAC and the work that you do, and you already mentioned how important kind of prevention work is to you and you think in general in the community. So what do you think is the value of kind of providing this education to students in high school at a younger age than kind of the consent tea, which was at a university and at an older kind of cohort?
I mean, I think it's critical. If your conversations around consent aren't starting until you're dealing with folks in their 20s, you're too late. Most folks have had sexual experiences by then, and many people have already experienced their boundaries being breached by the time they get to university. And so to start that earlier, and as Chelsea said, these are conversations you can have as a parent with your children right from toddlerhood, and we hope that parents are doing that. But we don't get to be there for all of those conversations, but what we can do is offer this kind of education in the community. And TRU is such a, it's a part of our community. It's not just like a university where a few people go. Most, parts of our community are tied in some way to the university, whether we have family that work there or we went there or, we play sports there, we access different facilities. It really is a community hub, so it makes sense for TRU to be doing some of this outreach work in the community and partnering with the organizations that are experts on it, right? Like KSAC, and making that offer to the school district to provide some of this important information and education. It's a way for us to work together, right? None of these organizations are islands. We have to work together if we want to make any effort in addressing sexualized violence. And so this is one way of doing this. And as Chelsea and Tanya said, it's a small step. it's just the beginning of something that I'm confident will turn into a larger project as it unfolds.
Great answer. Thank you so much. And what do you think, kind of going off of what you've just kind of said, what do you think the implications are for not kind of providing this education at this age, especially?
I think that oftentimes we put too much onto parents, and we rely too much that that parents are going to provide this kind of comprehensive consent-based education to their children. And for whatever reason, not all parents are able to do that. There's lots of different barriers, and it's not a judgment on parents. It's just a fact that not every child is going to receive this information. And to be a responsive and compassionate society, we need to make sure that everyone, regardless of the kind of home life that they have or the foundation that they have in their own education, are able to access this. Yeah. And that is the role that our school district serves, right? We're preparing children and youth not just with reading and writing and arithmetic, but with how to be healthy, functioning members of society. And part of that is having a strong understanding of consent, because consent isn't just about sexual relationships, right? Consent is something that we practice in all relationships, and it is to the benefit of everyone that folks have a solid understanding of consent.
Yep, agreed. I agree so much. And does anyone else want to speak on that at all? Like, Megan, maybe you have something to add from your kind of work at TRU that you're doing?
Yeah, I definitely agree with everything Alex said, and it kind of made me think too, it's almost like when you get a new puppy, you want to teach it all of the good things and the good habits, and if you don't, it doesn't mean you can't correct them or reteach later, but it can be harder and there can be sort of destructive things built in. And so when we're surrounded by rape culture in pop culture, everywhere around us, right? We get these messages that normalize non-consent. If we can start providing those scripts for a more consent-based culture from a young age, then people know that it exists and how it can be done and how it can be respected. And then that continuity when they get to university is obviously helpful. So hopefully that didn't glitch out too much, but those are some of my thoughts as Alex was chatting too.
And Megan, thank you so much. I want to jump on that because I was sort of just jotting that down, thinking about how spaces like the Consent Tea really allows opportunity to critically assess and dismantle the stories that we are taught that go back to like fairy tales, in which we're reading about sort of gender identity and relationships and what those expectations are. And I feel like we talk about that quite a bit, is sort of what were we taught at very young ages that we're never really assessing or dismantling, and seeing how much that messaging is embedded in what we expect from our relationships and our interactions. So again, that's another opportunity to connect and dismantle it.
I agree, Alicia. Thank you for bringing that up, and I hope to kind of talk more about the role of pop culture and the role of gender roles and all of that in this conversation and in this issue. But before we kind of move on, is there anything anyone else wants to add right now before we go into more pop culture-y stuff? We're okay? All right. So one of my questions that I really wanted to ask, and the one where I was like, I'm going to start rambling because a lot of my research that I did specifically for this interview was kind of about this. But how do you all think that events such as Consent Cafe, and we've kind of already touched on this as well, they help us to reframe violence and deprogram, quote unquote. And this article that I'm gonna have to link it to everyone because I'm just way too excited about it. But it was this research that was conducted at McMaster University, and this researcher just kind of sat down some male students and asked them about their beliefs around consent. and relationships. And it was just so interesting to see some of these answers and these beliefs that a lot of these men in this particular situation had around, how they felt about asking for verbal explicit consent, how that felt awkward, even though they knew it was probably the best thing to do, or kind of how they understood that locker room talk was not acceptable, but within their group it was because that was the culture. And so kind of, I know that's a lot of different things to throw at you, but just I think, how did these types of events where we're talking about the implications of our behaviors and the implications of culture, how does this really help to reframe all of these like messages that we have received and also messages that we then reinforce and express in the world? Anyone can tackle that. I know that's a big question, but
I'll have one thing to say, and I know that it will open up, but I remember attending my first consent tea, and again, having, over these past few years, of course, I've received so much education from everyone, but I was really struck in particular by one student that said, well, I'm not the problem. I'm not going to perpetuate violence. But then also in the conversation of if there was an incident that you could possibly be an active bystander, how would you approach that? Oh, well, I'd really have to weigh and measure that. And I was just so struck by someone thinking, well, I'm not going to commit violence, but I might stand by and watch it happen. And so thinking about how we are interconnected with the potential for violent acts without necessarily being the one to perpetrate that. So that really has stuck with me, and that's what's coming up right now.
Yeah, I'll echo that a little bit. There's this idea that either you're a perpetrator or you're a good person, and that there isn't a whole spectrum in between. And part of what events like this do is create a place that's both safe but also accountable to reflect on some of that and to understand how, pieces of the way that you interact with the world, the way you engage with other people, outside of, what might be called a sexual assault, but other pieces of your life, how that might perpetuate rape culture, and how that can create circumstances in which sexual assault is condoned. So I think there will always be a segment of the population who choose to perpetuate violence or to perpetrate violence. I don't think we can ever eliminate violence. That's just the sad reality. But I think we can reduce it. And part of that work is doing this educational work with people that are somewhere in the middle of that spectrum, right? The ones who don't even understand the way that their behaviors might be harmful, or the way that they're playing into rape culture. So those are the people that we're targeting through this, not necessarily the horrifically violent offenders. I mean, if they learn something from this, great. But that's probably not the target demographic for this. It's the people that don't understand just how implicit we all are, every single one of us are, in perpetuating rape culture.
So well said. This is such a big question, so we could probably spend an hour talking about these issues around pop culture and the influences and this work. Just two quick points. One was interesting. I went to a conference, and I tend to try to go to breakout sessions around this topic if I can. And this one talked about really what we think is sort of, if we look at a spectrum of harm, we might think, oh, harmless, but using one of my favorite movies, The Notebook. Has anyone here seen The Notebook? Love that movie, right? Oh, Ryan Gosling, yes, please. However, when we started talking a bit about that movie and around, I can't remember Rachel McAdams' character's name, but around the boundary she was setting was not adhered to. The boundary kept being pushed and pushed and pushed until she finally succumbed, and then they had this romantic, they stayed together for the rest of their lives. But I think part of that is that's very nuanced, right? It's very romanticized that even though you set a boundary, you're not giving consent. You're actually, because setting boundaries is very hard. And I think when Alex mentioned around youth getting this information is because adults have a tough time setting their own boundaries. So how are we expecting them to teach that to their kids when a lot of us have troubles? So I think part of that is that nuanced piece around boundary setting, which is part of like consent, which will be part of what we talk around, like Tanya's piece around some of this work when we do our session with KSA. But the second thing is I think it pays off. And I will just say, like, by talking about this issue, and I'm just going to use my own personal example at my house, where here I'm a feminist, I'm like, you know, anti-violence, and like then my kids tell me, Mom, I didn't consent to that photo being taken of me. Mom, I didn't consent. So I've been using and it's coming back on me, and I'm like, okay, so they're listening to me at some point. But then I have to remember, like, it's about boundaries too. Like we talked about, consent isn't just about like sexualized violence, which is one of the focuses of what we want to do here, but it's also around like, I have to acknowledge my own boundaries as well with my kids if I want them to be able to enact boundaries with other people. Like I have to be a model for them. So anyways, it's kind of when I hear those words, I like laugh, but I'm also filled with pride because I'm like, okay, they're setting a boundary with me. Like maybe I'm the easy one to set a boundary with because I'm their mom, but my goal is, right, like having that language and that literacy about it. But yeah, that's my second point. But I just, going back to pop culture quickly, I just think that the Notebook is kind of on that spectrum, maybe not as like insidious or as harmful, but I think that's where it starts, right? Like I said, that simple conversation to start around setting boundaries, and then we're being pushed. And then, of course, we see the other spectrum where we see very violent images, so which are extremely harmful. So yeah, it plays and that's bombarded all the time, right? So we're seeing images or seeing boundaries being violated constantly. So it's really hard for people, like what was mentioned around people to kind of have a different or ability to enact what they know, because there's so much pressure that they've seen that if they ask for consent verbally, like you mentioned, Hannah, like, will they be made fun of by their partner? Because I've heard that before where people are like, I asked to kiss someone and they kind of were like, that's not romantic, you know? So it's kind of balancing and some of those stigmatizing things too. When you actually ask for consent, you may get in the response you weren't hoping for. So that's my
Notebook is
long-winded
such
ramblings.
a great example. It's Noah and Allie, FYI. I popped that in the chat. But thinking though that there are that idea of like that is the romantic narrative, is that there are obstacles to bulldoze through. And Hannah, we had talked about that, about sort of, you know, screwball comedies of the 1930s in which it's like you basically hate each other until you love each other. So that there needs to be this tension to make the story interesting. But so often it's just like setting boundaries and someone just blowing through that. And so thinking about those narratives that movies that we watch, stories, you know, again, like at the end of most fairy tales, some man is kissing a sleeping woman who did not consent to that. So again, just all of those little messages about how men are supposed to act and how women are supposed to act. And that's the sort of sense of like, oh, I'm not entirely sure this doesn't really align with how I feel about things. So anyhow, I think that is so interesting because now you can't unsee that when you are watching like a romantic comedy. And it's like, I mean, Love Actually, that's one of my new favorite Christmas things to do, is have a glass of wine and critically assess how problematic that movie is. And, you know, I think over time it's become increasingly like there are some power imbalances happening in this beloved movie that people watch yearly. And so I think it's really interesting because you can't unsee it at a certain point.
It also provides, oh, sorry, go ahead, Tanya.
Oh, I just wanted to say that the other day I was listening to music, which I don't always do, but there was a Taylor Swift song. I think it's Exile from the Folklore album. And the Taylor Swift character, or the Bon Iver character, says you didn't provide any signs, or you didn't have any warning signs. And then she's singing in response, there were so many signs. And it's the first song I've heard where that's contextualized, where one partner, the Bon Iver character, is saying there weren't any signs, and the Taylor Swift's character singing, but there were so many signs. I was giving so many signs, right? And we often talk about consent, and again, this is connected to that literacy, I think, in the difficulty of of those nuances. We often talk about consent like it's a clear thing, like it's a yes or a no. And if somebody asks for it or somebody provides it, you're definitely going to know it for sure. But the reality is, we primarily rely on our nonverbal communication, and not everybody is able to understand accurately other people's nonverbal responses, right? So the Taylor Swift character is clearly giving signs, but the Bon Iver character has no idea that those signs mean anything at all. He doesn't see the signs that exist there. And I promise never to rely so heavily on a Taylor Swift song again, but I think it does provide some opportunity for us to explore that disconnect between what's being perceived versus what's being produced or offered, right?
We just have a listening party where we just jam out to some Taylor Swift for the next hour and just really pull out those threads. But again, I think that's thinking about accessibility, because when we talk about consent and we talk about sexualized violence, there's so much complexities, and we're all bringing our own experiences and feelings and bias into that. So I think when we talk about, popular culture in particular, it's such a great, possibly safe way to just recognize it when you're, listening to it or watching it or whatever, and see how it pops up. So I love that you brought that example to the table. Thank you.
Yeah, I think definitely some sort of future kind of consent-related event should be like we all sit around and listen to music, popular music, or watch popular movies and be like, how are we perpetuating rape culture in these messaging? But Megan, I think you unmuted a little while ago. I don't know if you still have a thought that you'd like to share.
Yeah, kind of similar to what Alicia said. I think that events like this, they provide a safer space to have conversations that take kind of the onus off the individual immediately, and they're a little bit less charged, because people aren't like, oh, this is that one time that I didn't quite read it right, and then maybe I caused all this harm. So when people are kind of out of that super activated level, they can have better learning conversations. I think that's a really important piece of it. And I had one other. Oh, and then I think what that also does, especially when you take it out of the context of sexualized violence, is that people all of a sudden become more able to see the no cues, and they realize that they actually can see those signs, and they make choices about what they do after that. And so it's really interesting to take that conversation and then sort of relate it back to intimate or sexualized encounters, and see how actually maybe you could see that no, but you weren't paying attention to it, or you chose not to quite recognize it because that made you uncomfortable or insecure or whatever it was. So I think it's a cool format to be able to have those kinds of conversations.
Can I just comment on, thank you, Megan, for saying that, because I think it's interesting. Tanya and I attended a webinar like a few months ago, was it? Researcher out of USC or somewhere, California, Berkeley, somewhere. And they were doing research around consent with 2S LGBTQ, 2S plus students. And it was so intriguing because it was sort of taking that, what the students were saying they're researching is around that nonverbal cueing piece, because I think that is, like we've said, the gray, it's not a black-white issue, right? And it was so intriguing because they were just talking about like those, especially when they had like an intimate partnership that they had like an ongoing relationship with, because we can't forget, like, consent is still integral and ongoing. It's not just, a one experience, it's ongoing in a relationship. And they were just saying how they found that people who were ongoing partners had those nonverbal cues that, you might like come up and like scratch someone's neck or not, that those developed into their consent language, that they kind of had, that they spoke to each other in a nonverbal way, which I found like so intriguing. I need to do more reading about it and learning about it. But I think that's the part of it, is that when you are more in tune and pay, like Megan said, like maybe if you take it out of this context and you start to pay attention to other nonverbal cues, then maybe during the sexual context you would be like, oh, okay, how can I relate these? But I found it very interesting because for many other things, we do acknowledge if someone looks mad, sad, we pick up on those cues quite well, I think, in general, right? So it's intriguing to think about, like, how could we do a better job of those nonverbal cues when it comes to consent. So thank you for bringing that up, Megan. Super important.
Yeah, I appreciate that as well, and also acknowledging that these aren't yes and no only, right? Sometimes we have a I don't know or I need more information before I can make my decision and offer my consent, and that takes time sometimes, and sometimes that takes more information, and those are not easy cues to recognize necessarily. I like that term, non-cues or no cues. I like that, and sometimes the way we express I don't know or I'm not sure or I haven't decided yet can feel unfamiliar to us, never mind to the person we are in relationship with, which is why it's so important that we have these kinds of conversations and we grow this literacy within a relational context, right? So people don't understand this just as an either or, a good or a bad, a yes or a breach. There's so much more involved in us talking about consent, which is also, to Alex's point, why it's so essential that we talk about it from very, very early on. This is a life skill, and we don't expect people just to jump into Shakespeare. So why would we expect them to jump into the nuances of sexualized consent conversations?
I agree. This is such an interesting part of our conversation that we've gone into, and I wish that we could talk about it forever because I just find it so fascinating and helpful. But we are, I think, running out of time a little bit. I think everyone wants to kind of head out at 2. So I want to kind of like open up the floor for anyone who wants to add anything right now on the conversation that we're currently having about kind of like nuances, cues, yes and no's, conversations about it, and how that kind of changes our narratives. Okay, we'll move on to the last question. I think we're about to, actually we'll do last 2 questions because I think we have enough time, but just I want to be mindful of everyone's time. So how do events such as the Consent Cafe help to support the range of wellness and violence prevention and response work that you all do in the community? And I feel like we've touched on this a little bit, but if I want to kind of create some space for us to talk about that, if anyone has any particular points to bring up or something that they'd like to speak on.
I think for us, it creates an entry point for people that might not even be aware of their own how to frame their own experiences. They might not have the language or understanding to frame those experiences, and even if they do, they might not know what supports are available to them. So for CASAC to have the opportunity to go and engage with, a group of students that normally we wouldn't have crossover with. It helps those students to understand that they aren't alone in their experiences and that there are supports available if they need them. So that's, for us, part of this kind of thing is seeing that benefit of community outreach and engagement, right? We're so pleased to talk about this content specifically, but really any opportunity where we're able to let folks know about our services and to validate their experiences is a good opportunity for us.
I'll just quickly add too, for me, one of the things I love most about my role is being able to collaborate with community organizations. And I've been, I'm a one person sort of center and have been for many years. And so for me, I've really relied on the expertise of people in the community to help support what I do. And so for me, just so Alex has been gracious enough to support this event by her attendance one day on Thursday. She will be coming. Also, we have 2 members of the CASAC staff coming to support this work both days. I've also made connections with our Safe Spaces coordinator who helps support 2S LGBTQ 2S+ youth in the community, and they will be facilitating. I've connected with Peyton from Ask Wellness, who's one of the health educators there, and Peyton will be coming. We have our some student wealth ambassadors who are returning who will be helping facilitate. We have Megan who's helping as well. And so for me, it's when we have like community partnerships, it's super important. And just also to, people may not know this, but Tanya and I started this like discussion about a year ago. And so of course, COVID has kind of made it a little bit interesting in how we've, going to go about doing this. But back in the fall, we did have 3 practicum students. We had 2 human service students and a 4th-year nursing student start to work on this, how we could adapt something that we developed in the university context to a high school context. And so one of their roles was to engage with stakeholders in the community to get their feedback about doing something like this. So at the time, we did engage with one of the counselors from KSAC. We engaged with the Y Women's Shelter. We engaged with Kamloops Immigrant Services. We engaged with Safe Spaces. We put the call out to more organizations, but we kind of were only able to meet with those who were able to make that meeting. And so our goal, once again, is to we would love to, of course, see, of course, Tanya and I also as board members of KSAC would love to see this like as an expansion of the services that we can provide from our agency. And so with that, more engagement is needed, just to put that forth. We have obviously made connections with the one school district to get their part of this, to get a pilot, to get their feedback on how it worked for them, get the students' feedback too on, did this land well with you? What did you learn? What could we do to it, to make it better? We did have some youth who we know review our consent toolkit for us, give us some feedback. We have reached out to the Aboriginal support worker at KSA to see how we can ensure like we're decolonizing in this work. So there's lots of things when I think for some people think we just show up and we offer this event, but there's so much planning and intention that goes behind it. And part of that is having the expertise of people in the community to help us develop what we're doing. And so Hannah, you can, you know this, we have people from various organizations and us as the Student Wellness Ambassador team helping support the development of all the lessons that we're doing. So it's not just Tanya and I saying this is what we're doing this day, we're getting feedback from other organizations. We're making sure it's an activity-based day because of these are grade 8, grade 9s. We're also aligning all this work with the overall learning objectives of their health kind of focus for those years of school. So grade 8, grade 9, like what their learning objectives are and learning outcomes need to be. So it takes quite a lot of methodical, intentional planning and relationship building to kind of make something like this happen. But for me, this is where I love what I do, because it's like to see everyone's ideas coming together. So it's not just me directing all of this, it's all of us coming together as a group to really do, I think, do the best work we can. And it can't just come from myself and Tanya, it needs to come from our community. So I think that's just one thing I'm really excited about piloting this, is to see how this lands with the students, and just the feedback they can offer for how we can do, if we do this again, what we can learn from it and how we can do a better job. So that's my long answer, but I'm super excited and super grateful, on, really kind of short notice, kind of getting the green light to actually host this, and trying to pull us all together in the last little bit here. So I just want my gratitude for everybody who's helping support this work.
Thank you so much, Chelsea. Why don't we do some takeaway messages? Does anyone want to kind of touch on what the main takeaway message you would like to see from the Consent Cafe is, in your opinion?
I think for me, the takeaway is that consent is an act to be practiced in every part of your life. Right from the moment that you start interacting with other humans as a baby, and learning the skills to be able to do that effectively in all life situations. So whether that's in your relationships that are intimate and exploring sexuality, whether that's in a workplace and setting boundaries with your coworkers or your supervisors, and even for yourself and understanding what feels good or right or okay for you individually. So the hope, I think, with this educational offering is to provide students with an opportunity to do some of that reflecting, to learn some of those skills, and to be able to flex that consent muscle so that it can be transferred into all these different parts of their lives. And so they don't arrive at university or the workplace or wherever not having been able to hone these skills. That's the hope.
Well, I would just thank you, Alex. You're so articulate as always. My, I guess, thought is that consent takes practice. So it's not like we're going to come to KSA, we're going to go through this day, and everyone's going to be magically really good at getting consent or setting boundaries. I think it's a literacy building opportunity. But I'm hoping that the way we frame the day, there's going to be times for reflection. And in the journal, actually, Hannah and other student are creating, there are going to be questions in there for reflections so that as people leave, it's encouraged that they reflect on these things and practice. Practice with people that you feel comfortable with first, because it can be really hard if you are trying to set a boundary or get consent in a situation where there is a power, differential. So I think practice helps us gain those skills and feel confident in our abilities. So just to let people remember that it's not, it's not an overnight thing. You've got consent all of a sudden, right? So, yeah.
And I'll add that maybe us going into first this school of the arts, and maybe other schools will provide us the opportunity to be those mentors or those models who not just seek consent, but are empowered through seeking consent, and thus counteracting some of those poor pop cultural models, right? Where they can see that by seeking consent, you feel healthier, you feel happier, you feel more connected to the people around you, and you create a more equitable environment in which to play and love and work and exist, and maybe we get to do that, hopefully.
Before I answer that question, I wanted to add one little piece to your question before, Hannah, about how this helps us with our work as well. So kind of like Chelsea said, in getting feedback from people, I also love these discussions and events for sort of gauging where people are at and learning from what they already know and how they're already conceptualizing things. So I think that really helps in future education and in being able to see where people are at, because oftentimes students, obviously my experience is usually with university students, but I'm sure it's the same in high schools, and I know younger kids these days are pretty on the ball a lot of times, and so learning from them is also invaluable, I think. And then for main takeaways for me, I think one piece of it is just to kind of embrace the awkward. So it echoes kind of what we said here, where it's not always easy, it's not always straightforward, black or white. So kind of embrace that and work through it with your partner or partners in a good way, or the people in your life. And I think the other piece is really about if you hear a no or sense a no, that's okay, and listening to that and reacting to it, not finding a different way to get a yes, but like taking the no and being like, okay, that stings a little, but I will survive if the answer is a no. So I think that's the other side of the consent conversation, is catching that and respectfully either holding it or sort of managing that yourself, because it feeds into boundaries as well. It's only half of the game is setting a boundary. The other half of it is respecting other people's boundaries. And so I think being able to have that two-way balanced conversation is something I really hope people take away from this event.
Megan's brilliant. I've always known this, but it's so interesting you bring that, Meg, because when I met with all the KSAC participants last week, Tanya and I, and we asked for feedback, and one of the counselors came back and said exactly what you said. Can there be space to talk about what happens if you get the no? And because it can feel awkward, it can feel like you may feel dismissed. You may have all these feelings that you're processing. And that might feel crummy for you, but also it's respecting that boundary. So it's thank you for bringing that up, because that's, part and parcel of what we'll be including in some of this work, because especially at that age, these students may range from 13 to 15, based on grade 8, grade 9. And so there can be that feeling of rejection, right? That they may ensue. And so it's like reframing that experience around that. So brilliant. Thank you for mentioning that.
I agree. And often when we talk about consent, we are focused on the yes and not on the no. So it really is essential that we, even behind Chelsea right now, we see all the words yes, we see, right? We don't see no, not yet.
This has been so awesome for me. I don't know. I feel so grateful to have been a part of this. You are all clearly brilliant, amazing people in the community, and this work that you're doing is so inspiring, I think. I really want to I was going to say, I hope that everyone has the opportunity, if you're comfortable, to send me a headshot, because I really want to create some social media content and just general resources, especially with these takeaway messages. They're short, they're sweet, and they're like so informative, and I'd love to create like some little pieces with your guys' like headshot or something. So let me know if you're comfortable with that. This has just been really cool. Is there anything else that anyone wants to add at the end here?
Thanks.
No, I feel like,
You
sorry.
did an awesome job facilitating all of us. So great. This was awesome, and I always learn hearing from my colleagues too. So it's a benefit. I'm learning lots, and it's just so awesome to see so many passionate people doing this work. And thank you for covering this and being willing to like put some stories forth. So thank you.
Thank you.
Of course. Thanks for saying that. I was very nervous. I'm not used to facilitating something like this, so it's been very fun. I'm glad that this was the first opportunity. Thanks everyone for coming. I hope you have a great rest of your day.
Thanks, Hannah. Thanks, everybody. Nice to see you all.
Nice to see you. Thanks, Hannah.